Greetings and welcome. We are in AP Senior English, and today the course of study for us is a discussion and introduction to what we will call at times the Arthurian motif. That is to say, the storyline that we will usually refer to as King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I've already given a series of observations that I think on Learn Strong we are calling an Introduction to King Arthur Part 1. This then is King Arthur Part 2. And it's here that I want to try to flesh out and build some of the important storylines. As is often the case in a lit course, that's the introductory collegiate kind of lit course as this one is, a 10, 10, 10, 20 offering. We can't do as much reading as we would like. That's unfortunate. Some of us will say that's very fortunate. Thanks, Mr. McGee. We've done enough reading. The origination of the source work here is difficult. It's problematic. Not unlike what we called the Troy Tale. Remember part 4 of Edith Hamilton's mythology is kind of that amalgamation or bringing together of a whole bunch of strands of storyline. The same is true for King Arthur and the King Arthur motif. The probably single best place, and it's the ground from which I'll draw most of my observations, is from a book that I highly recommend that you have in your library going forward called Bulfinch's Mythology. Bulfinch was a classical scholar, not unlike Hamilton. And he's kind of like the early form of Cliff Notes for King Arthur and the Song of Roland and the stories and songs of poetry of Charlemagne. All of that is comprised in this volume. You can get it in paperback. So the first time that you see that in a used bookstore, remember it's a strange name so it can stick out. Bulfinch's Mythology. You may want to purchase that. It's not a bad volume to have in your library. I, of course, would recommend that you sit down at some point and read it for the same reason I recommend you read Edith Hamilton's Mythology. There's just a whole lot of different stories that are brought to a single place. Let's talk now about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I want to do two things in my lecture now. One, I want to give you the overarching storyline, and then I want to finish with some observations about the importance of the Arthurian motif, not only in the English mindset, but also in the American mindset. Let's begin, first of all, with the story. The story of Arthur is a story of any number of types of strands of storytelling. Probably the most central place is to begin with the weapon or the sword that we often refer to as Excalibur. This becomes, no pun intended, the lightning rod around which so much of the story will be told. Arthur, much like many of the great heroes of antiquity, comes from dubious parentage. Arthur's father will sleep with a woman who is not his wife. His father will use magic to seduce the woman. That magic is provided by the great wizard Merlin. Merlin is the Tiresias figure of our story. Do you remember Tiresias is that classic motif in Greek mythology? Tiresias is an interesting cat because he has lived both the life of a man as well as the life of a woman, which, by the way, doesn't make him unusual. Remember, the Greeks believe in reincarnation. So your soul has inhabited any number of bodies that are some female, some male. The thing that makes Tiresias important is that he can remember both of those occurrences, right? And in the tradition that we will call the Greek views on love, men and women never can understand each other. You can consult your Plato Symposium here for a fuller understanding of this idea. Men and women can never understand each other because we ostensibly live in two different kinds of universes. Okay? But Tiresias has tremendous power because he can see both the past as well as the present as well as the future, and he can remember both the life of a man as well as the life of a female. Male as well as female. And that makes him to have a special kind of knowledge, unlike others. Merlin is a similar kind of figure, only we call him a wizard. Tiresias, not so much a wizard, not so much a magician wizard, like Merlin. Merlin will dabble in the black arts. He has some ability to create potions and this kind of thing. And he is convinced to allow King Arthur's father to change his looks to sleep with a woman who is not his queen, who is not his wife. From this union, King Arthur is conceived. So let's just say it for your notes right away. When I said his parentage is dubious, we can go ahead right out loud and say it. King Arthur is a bastard. That is to say, his real mother is not the one who bears him. So from the very beginning, let's point out, this is a story, as Freud will make much of. This is a story about sexuality and perverted sexuality. And we're going to see this happening over and over again in the story, not unlike, in some ways, some of the perversion, sexually speaking, that we will find in other of our stories. Namely, we think here, of course, of that Troy tale story, all right? Arthur is born and is immediately taken away by Merlin. Merlin will raise the young boy, and the reason is because Arthur's father almost immediately will die. Now, there's different versions of this part of the story. What makes Arthur's father so significant is that he has the sword Excalibur. He already has it. He's been appropriated this sword by the Lady of the Lake. The origination of Excalibur is questionable, where it comes from. I mean, we, of course, have the joke from Monty Python's Holy Grail, strange women lying in ponds is no basis for a system of government. And yet, there it is. For the English, that's exactly what gives the legitimacy of power, that sword. Where does that sword come from? Well, it's sometimes called the Sword of Kings, and it's derived from this lake. In other words, some mythic place. By the way, symbolism, very important in the Arthurian motif, because King Arthur and the story of King Arthur is ostensibly a Christian story. And you're going to have all this important symbolism. Threes, or the Trinity, become real important. Water, obviously, very important. If you know anything about Christianity, the sacred rite of baptism obviously plays an important role. Water becomes an important symbol as well. So from this water, from this lake, comes the sword. Before he dies, Arthur's father will take the sword and will stick it inside of a large rock. And he will say, "He that draws the sword from the stone shall be king." The next moment in our story, Arthur is a young man. He's very young, probably in his teens. And he has been raised by another family. Merlin has taken the boy and given him away. Arthur has a brother who he thinks is think of Oedipus, right? He thinks this is his real family. His brother Kay is the knight in training, and Arthur is kind of like his helper guy. At a famous jousting contest, Kay loses his sword. In large measure because King Arthur, not yet King Arthur, just a young boy, is negligent and allows for the sword to be stolen. While running after the thief in the middle of the woods, Arthur stumbles upon the sword in the stone. It's there, realizing he isn't going to get Kay's sword back, that he will draw the sword from the rock. He does it effortlessly. He does it. The sword just comes right out of the rock. It's not even like it's work for Arthur. And in this moment, immediately Arthur becomes controversial. Because for years, everyone in the community already knows whoever draws the sword from the stone gets to be king. Lots and lots of knights have tried. None of them have been successful. Arthur does it immediately. For a brief moment, his brother, Kay, stepbrother, his half-brother, Kay, adopted brother, we would say, will say it. He's the one that took the sword out of the stone. But Kay can't lie. And so he says, no, it was Arthur. Arthur? The kid? That scrawny little boy? Arthur? He's the one who draws the sword from the stone? Immediately, Arthur's stepfather tells him, "You've done something you shouldn't have done. Put it back." So Arthur does. Oh, okay. Sticks it back into the rock again. Immediately, a number of knights try to draw the sword from the stone because, hurrah, he must have loosened it. Nope, they can't do it. It's at this point that all of the people begin to look at Arthur like, who are you? And immediately Arthur's stepfather, will say, you're not my son. And it's at this point for the first time, much like Oedipus, that Arthur now will be told, what? What do you mean I'm not your son? No, Merlin brought me to you. Merlin brought you to me, and I raised you. Merlin? Arthur asks, what's a Merlin? It's at this point Merlin shows up in the story. And Merlin will in fact say, yeah, you're not even my son. So let's point out something here really quickly. I mean, there's this really great moment in the Odyssey when Telemachus goes to the king of Sparta, Menelaus, and he says, he comes walking up, and immediately Menelaus says, you're Odysseus' son. To which Telemachus says, well, that's what they tell me. I never met the guy. And again, Menelaus will say, along with Helen by his side, oh no, I can see it in your face. You're clearly Odysseus' boy. And again, Telemachus will say, well, I don't know. I really don't know, because I mean, it's not like I ever met the man, and that's what everybody tells me, but I never met him. Something very similar is going to happen here with Arthur. He doesn't have a clue about his past. It's all an enigma. And let's just say that for our notes. Almost everything about Arthur is an enigma. The whole story is wrapped in mystery and enigma. And that's by design to some degree, it seems. Merlin is the one who kind of has the key to unlock it all. Immediately, two sides break out. And immediately you have civil war. So Arthur's beginning of a kingdom and being a king doesn't start out very well. Think here immediately of your understandings from Plato's Republic, right? Arthur's not a very good unifier at all. Immediately, all of these knights take up sides. Half of the knights will support him. The other half of the knights will say, no way, we're not going to have a bastard for a king. There is no way. This stupid young kid, no way. Even if he has Excalibur, no way. And it leads to a major contest. In that contest, the story told in different ways. In that contest, Arthur does something very interesting. He shows tremendous heroism, great courage. And when he subdues one of the knights who is fighting against him, the knight says, you have to kill me. I will never, ever bow down to you because you are not a knight. To which Arthur will respond, you're absolutely right, I'm not a knight. And he hands over Excalibur to his enemy, and he says, you're a knight, use Excalibur and knight me to make me a knight. Well, in the moment he hands over the sword, obviously there's the opportunity for the opponent to just take the sword, run with it, and become the king. But in an important moment, Arthur seems to understand something in his innocent spirit about what it is to lead and gain loyalty. He gains immediately the loyalty of his enemy, who says, something's going on here. You must have the blood of Uther Pendragon in you. Uther, of course, is Arthur's father. And I will knight you, and then I will be your loyal knight. It's at this moment, then, that Arthur will begin his rise to prominence. So let's say it this way. One of the things that makes Arthur so important in the image and the mind of the English people is that he is the great unifier. He brings together all of the disparate families and bands of men. He unites them. He conquers all of known Britain and becomes the great king. By the way, there will be huge debate about whether this cat actually ever lived, much like the debate about whether there ever really was a Beowulf, and so on and so forth, right? These are big debates that are, they're resolvable by academics. But for our discussions here, it's not that big of a deal one way or the other, because we're really focused on the story itself. Upon uniting everyone, Arthur does, let's call it 2, yea, 3 things that are really important next. Once he subdues the country, he does 3 things. One, he decides he's going to marry. Her name is Guinevere, and he's going to marry this beautiful girl. who he has fallen in love with. Merlin has warned Arthur about this girl. He has said, you know, you got to be really careful about women, and especially this girl, and I kind of have a bad feeling about the future, and a very important friend is going to betray you. But when you're in love, you can't hear. Love is deaf as well as blind, it's said in the story, and Arthur can't hear. All he can see is Guinevere there dancing around the flames, you see, and of course that's enough for him, and he's smitten and all of that. So, you know, he's like, sweet. He even asks Merlin, can you make her love me? And Merlin gets really offended, and he's like, look, no more of that. I already did that once, and it didn't turn out very well for all parties involved. No, I'm not making you, using magic. You know, you got to do this one on your own, son. Arthur is able to do it on his own, and he gets the girl. The second important thing that he does is he says, I'm going to build a city. It will be the city of my kingship, and it will become the most important city in all of England, Britain, and we'll call it Camelot. It's only a model. Okay? Now, for those of you who, by the way, for those of you who watch Monty Python's Holy Grail, it is an incredibly intellectual performance. It's comedy, of course, on some level, but it's really, I mean, every single line is carrying double and even triple meanings. Camelot is a model. It is absolutely a model. It is the model city. It is pure Plato writ at large. If you could invent the perfect city, what would it look like? The answer is Camelot. That's the name of it, Camelot. And they just build it. He just builds it. You know, the idea is he just clears a plain and he builds this city from nothing. This city will then become where he lives. Not finished. Number 3. I said yay 3 for a reason. Within the middle of the city, dead center of the city, there will be a huge castle. Years later, there will be cities that will be built, constructed with this notion in mind, where you will put a religious icon, a temple, a castle, a sacred building in the dead center of the town, and then around that you will build the rest of the city. That's exactly what Camelot is. Not done yet. Inside of the castle, there will be a special room. Inside of that special meeting hall, think of course of Hrothgar's famous hall in Beowulf, huh? Inside that special room, there will be a table, not just any table. Now the origin of whether this idea comes from Arthur or from Merlin is in much debate. Be that as it may, the table is not square, it is round. Now, the reason that the round table is so important is because when you have a square table, you have an identifiable place where the head of the table sits. Depending on how you lay the table out, the end closest to the throne is the end where the king would sit. In other words, he's in charge. What's significant about a round table? We have our first introduction of political ideology called democracy. You could argue that in many ways, Arthur is the first step towards the notion all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And it is iconically represented with a round table. When all of the knights, those engaged in chivalry, when all of the knights meet at that table and Arthur sits down, he is just one more voice. Now granted, he is the king, but all the rules apply to Arthur just like they apply to all the other knights. That is significant. In other words, he is not that extra special. Notice in allowing that kind of belief, Arthur immediately becomes the most beloved leader in the history of Britain. Instead of putting himself above all others, a la Machiavelli's Prince, and saying, I will rule through fear, I will rule through edict and command, Arthur places himself as an equal with the other knights, and in so doing, gains their ultimate love and loyalty. The King Arthur motif answers Machiavelli's view, it's better to be feared than loved. Arthur answers that with garbage. It's far better to be loved. I will prove it. And the way you gain the love of your knights is to say we're all equals when we sit at this table. Your voice and your opinion, every bit as important as mine. That's a monumental moment in the history of political thought. Whether it actually ever occurred that there really was a city called Camelot, and we don't know, and whether there actually ever occurred a real table called the Round Table, the idea for English people will become foundational to the way they think about politics in England. In other words, this is a symbol that will become forever a symbol. And all of a sudden, notice the symbolism of this story. It begins with a sword, Excalibur, but Arthur uses the sword to gain unity, and then he constructs the important next symbol, that round table, where when you're sitting at that table, you're all equals. That becomes a pivotal moment in political thought. Notice Arthur didn't have to do this. We're back to the myth of Gyges and that ring. Arthur has the sword of total power. He could defeat all of the other guys with that sword, and he could rule as a despot, as a tyrant. He could do that. He doesn't do it. He consciously chooses otherwise, and in that moment, he gains their loyalty and their love. They would never, ever want to let him down. Enter the greatest of all the knights, Sir Lancelot. Lancelot is not English. He is an outsider. We will see this recapitulated, this idea recapitulated again and again in our stories, that an outsider comes in. At first, Lancelot is such a great fighter that he cannot be defeated. Ultimately, are you ready for this? Arthur has to go one-on-one with Lancelot. Arthur calls on the power of Excalibur in one version of the story, and Arthur defeats Lancelot, but in so doing, he breaks Excalibur. He breaks the sword to defeat the great knight, Lancelot. Two things happen out of this. One, immediately there's a problem if the sword is broken. Merlin will counsel Arthur to return the sword to the Lady of the Lake. She will reconfigure or rebuild the sword. The famous line by Merlin is, "You have broken what cannot be broken." This will become an indicator of a forecast to come, that perfect harmony, idyllic unity inevitably wrecks on the rocks of disharmony, and it's coming. But the Lady of the Lake returns to Arthur Excalibur mended. Okay, so it's now his sword again. The second important thing is that Lancelot has been bested. And instead of kind of wandering off into the wilderness to be sad about that fact and lament for the rest of his days that he's been bested, he immediately devotes the rest of his life to Arthur. I will forever fight for you. Now, this notion of the battle knight, or the thane, as he's often called in our mythologies, is a really, really important and ancient institution. We see it in the Bushido code of the samurai, especially in the pre-Tokugawa regimes. We see it also in other kinds of traditions where you have a group of warriors that will devote their entire life to the leader. They will pledge their life, they will pledge their fortunes and everything, and then they will fight for that king. Lancelot says, that's what I will do. So now Arthur has gained the greatest warrior of all time. Next part of our story will sound very much like the love triangle of an earlier story. You'll remember Menelaus and Paris and Helen. One girl, two guys. Unfortunately, Arthur is quite brilliant and beautiful and handsome, but he is nothing compared to Lancelot. Lancelot is drop-dead gorgeous. In fact, there are stories of girls seeing him and fainting at sight. He is that stunningly handsome. We'll even hear the story of the Lady of Shalott, who completely will ruin her life just for one chance to see him. He has what Max Weber later will call tremendous charisma. He can walk into a room and immediately govern the room by nothing other than his looks and the energy that kind of extends from those looks. If you will, he's the first Brad Pitt, you see. When he shows up, everyone's just kind of like immediately taken by him. And when Lancelot shows up, Arthur's wife, Guinevere, immediately goes, who is that, and can I get his cell number, you see? And it doesn't take long before we have the famous love triangle, right? That's going to become a problem. Sure enough, there is a tryst. There is a little hanky-pankying going on. And ultimately, this will become the source of some serious problems for Arthur. But Arthur's problems are only beginning. Because Arthur had a half-sister named Morgana, and she has become a witch. And as she has gotten older, Morgana has started to hang out with Merlin. She wants to know Merlin's famous charms, his famous spells. Morgana uses one of those famous spells. She makes herself to look like Guinevere, and she sleeps with Arthur. Now, Arthur is sleeping with his half-sister. For those of you who say, serious dysfunctional family going on here. Yeah, but much like Oedipus, Arthur doesn't know that he's sleeping with his sister. She uses magic to kind of change the way she looks. But out of this union will come the son of Arthur. His name is Mordred. Mordred is our B-A-D bad villain of our story, and he is nasty. The reason he's nasty is because Morgana uses magic to make him a terribly evil person. Morgana's idea is very simple and very Machiavellian. She's going to use Mordred to take over the kingdom. Mordred absolutely has no problem with this, and technically speaking, it's okay because Mordred is the son of a king, and therefore has the right to be the king. All he has to do is just get rid of Arthur. So notice that Arthur begins to now have serious problems. Let's point it out. This is one of the foundational elements of this motif. You have this pristine moment in history when there's perfect unity. Back to our Plato lectures. Remember when we put that little thing on the board where it was like a little pyramid of sorts? Remember, and we said A, B, and C, and the C is the decline. Remember all of that? Remember the B was the ascension thing, right? You're doing that in the King Arthur motif. When he wins and he builds Camelot, it can't get any better. And it's at that moment when things are absolutely perfect, Arthur starts to have his problems. First with Lancelot and his wife Guinevere. Then secondly with his stepsister Morgana and their product son Mordred. But that's not all. 3. Arthur becomes sick. And he begins to die. Now you could make the argument that this is just stress-induced illness, long-term chronic stress-induced illness, whatever it is. Merlin, however, will say, the problem is he must drink from the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ, the famous cup of Christ. Now what is that all about? Well, in mythic literature, there is this notion that when Christ is crucified on the cross, there is an individual who has a cup or a grail there sitting at the base of the cross who actually has some blood of Christ drop into the cup. This cup, when drank from, will restore or rejuvenate life. And in, of course, one series of this storyline, if you drink from this cup, you live forever. For those of you that have seen the famous third episode or third part of the Indiana Jones storyline, they play that game, that part of the game, that if you drink from the cup of Christ, you live forever. There's a number of versions of this cup of Christ story. Dan Brown wrote his famous Da Vinci Code, for those of you who have either read the book or seen the movie. There's another interpretation of the cup of Christ as, believe it or not, being Mary Magdalene, the lover, if not lover, wife of Jesus Christ. And this is a huge debate in theological discussions about whether Christ ever had a wife or a lover and therefore a child. And if Christ had a child, what kind of legacy, and why would it end up being French? You see, that's the joke, you see. Sorry, Constance. So there you go. So Arthur sends his knights out on a special voyage, journey. And now, of course, we meet the journey motif. The journey motif of the knights is to find the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ. Bring it back to Arthur so that Arthur can drink from the cup of Christ. This will lead to the famous middle third of the story where these knights all go out looking for this cup of Christ. Of course, there's famous knights. All of these knights are well known in mythology. The one we must mention here, of course, is Percival, because Percival is the one who finds the cup. And in finding the cup of Christ, he also discovers the secret of the cup of Christ. The secret is phrased often in the form of a single line. As goes the king, so goes the state. Another way to say this is the king and the land are one. Now, this is foundational to understanding the English view of government. Their idea is, if you have a good king, it sounds very Platonist, doesn't it? If you have a good king, you will have a healthy country. And by the way, when we use the word healthy here, we don't just mean politically healthy, we mean literally healthy. That is to say, the crops will grow. That is to say, good things happen. The English people are very suspicious about bad weather. If they feel like there's bad weather that's long-term, like famine or whatever, or the plague, it's probably because their king or their ruler is a bad king or ruler. But if we have a healthy king, we will have a healthy state. And that's the secret of the cup of Christ. And of course, the English will use this going both directions, right? So for example, when things are going well, that's proof. Obviously, we have a good king. When things are going bad, I don't know. What's up with our king? Maybe our king needs to repent to God and to the church and, make amends or whatever. Think about how different a view that is, for example, from the American democratic notion that every 4 years, as will happen tomorrow again, you can always vote, and that is to say, change your leadership. You have the capacity to change whatever it is that you don't like. That's a different view from the English view, and King Arthur will be the instantiator of that view. Percival finds the cup, it's brought back to Arthur, Arthur drinks from the cup, and is immediately rejuvenated, awakens to find that his kingdom is in shambles because Mordred is about to take over. And this leads to the final third of the story, the final day of King Arthur, the final days of King Arthur, where ultimately Arthur must do two things. He must come face to face with his son, Mordred, and he's going to have to defeat him and kill him. So now notice we have the famous motif of father killing son and son killing father. We, of course, have seen this storyline before, haven't we? Remember, King Oedipus will kill his father Laius before he can become king. Freud will make much of this notion of the importance of patricide in storylines. We think, of course, of the storyline of Hamlet as well, don't we? Of sons killing fathers and all of those kinds of things, and right, vice versa. Right. Arthur and Mordred come face to face in the famous final moment. I should point out that in this famous battle, several important things happen, not least of which Lancelot re-enters the fray and he dies helping save Arthur. So, in some ways their friendship is restored. In the meantime, by the way, Guinevere has gone off to live in a nunnery. She actually took Excalibur with her. Arthur thought he had lost the sword. And she returns the sword to Arthur after he's drank from the Holy Grail, allowing him to be able to fight against his son. The final moments here are significant. Mordred strikes first by sticking a long spear straight through the center of the chest of Arthur. Arthur will pull his body down the length of the spear. In other words, he's conceding death, so that he can get close enough to his son to strike him with the sword Excalibur and kill him. And that's exactly what he does. Arthur kills his own son using Excalibur. The second thing, not unlike Beowulf's final, speeches or whatever after he's been bit in the throat by that dragon, Arthur doesn't give much for speeches. Instead, what he does is he turns to his helper guy, Bedivere, and he gives him the sword Excalibur and he tells him, go throw it in the lake. Bedivere rides off to do this, but he can't do it. He can't throw the sword into, this is the sword of kings, Excalibur. And he comes back and Arthur says, what happened when you threw the sword into the lake? And he's like, nothing, my lord. And Arthur said, you're lying. Throw it into the lake. And so Bedivere goes away. He does this like 2 times more. And finally he comes back and Arthur's like, I need you to do this. You have to trust me. Don't worry. The sword will come back again someday. This is going to be the pivotal moment of this motif. And sure enough, Bedivere does it.